Odors. So I've cleverly named this Something Smells in the World of Talking Plants, and you'll understand a little bit more about that and as I go through this. And before I get started, I always want to thank the people who mentored me and helped me get here, even though they're not here on this Zoom. These are all the folks that made me me. And I'd also like to thank you guys for coming and learning a little bit about what goes on in my world. So I'm going to ask you to please save your questions for the end, write them down. You're welcome to put them in the chat, and then I can answer them afterwards. So for today's timeline, this is everything I'm going to be going over in the talk. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. We're going to talk about communication, picking apart what it means to communicate. Then we're going to talk about plants, of course, that's what I study, plant signaling and cues, plant perception, both of which will make more sense when we go over communication, and then applications of all of this information. So starting off with me, I got my bachelor's in 2019 from Wilkes University. I'm originally from northeastern Pennsylvania. I did a bunch of different things. And then you see in the bottom left corner there, that is a Hadron Collider. I was at Brookhaven National Lab for a little bit. And I was not a physicist. I was in the woods back there studying ticks and all of the other yucky stuff that goes on there. I got my PhD in April of 2024. So all of those pictures are students that helped me complete my dissertation, and we'll be talking mostly about that kind of work today. And then for my postdoc, I am studying different pathogens to kill the spotted lanternfly, which I'm sure many of you are now overly familiar with. And so I do that in landscapes and vineyards, trying to figure out how we can sustainably control this pest. And then in the future, so I'm actually already a USDA employee, but I will be moving to Fargo, North Dakota to be a sugar beet entomologist in March. So that's very exciting, looking at sustainable agriculture there. So getting on to the talk here. In this day and age, right, we live in a world of constant communication. As humans, we kind of have a very long history with communication. We talk to each other in different languages. We have writing systems. We have things in books. We have text. We have Zoom, which we're on now. We've made all these computers and apps to communicate with one another. And if we're talking about the real definition, what does it mean to communicate? It's the transmission of information via signals. And signals can kind of encode all types of information. And there's many types of signals we humans use. So for instance, there's visual signals that are perceived by sight. So we have this guy, well, it's hidden, but he's waving. So that means, hello, I'm over here. There's vibrational signals, so those are perceived by hearing. There's this AI generated young man using a microphone or a megaphone, so who knows what he's saying, but that's another signal. There's tactile, being perceived by touch, so something like a handshake would fall under this, usually meaning it's nice to meet you. And an important thing to keep in mind is that communication is a two-part act. There's someone that's producing a signal, which is talking in this case. She's saying, wonderful weather we're having. And then the second part of communication is perceiving a signal. So this guy is hearing it and responding. So as humans, we generally are able to do both things. As a human, I am able to produce a signal and I am able to perceive a signal. And in fact, other animals can do this too, right? So we think of frogs vocalizing to establish their territory. Primates groom each other to show affection and form bonds with one another. We have peacocks that use their elaborate tail feathers to signal that they'd be a good mate. And a lot of signals in animals generally do mean that. I am a good mate. Um, but a big question in science is whether plants can do all of this too. Can plants produce signals? Can they perceive them too? And this is a pretty important question to answer. I have this silly little diagram that's pretty terribly blurry, but the point is that plants are 80% of the world's biomass. They provide us with food, medicine, they protect us from erosion, flooding in our soils, they add oxygen to our environment. which is what we breathe in to survive, right? And understanding physiology and behavior is important to continued use of these things. And the question that's been on the public's mind has been, do they produce signals? Do they perceive them? Do they communicate? So I love this picture of the plant talking to the phone, but if you look at different TV shows, so on the top left, we have Stinky the Stinkweed from Sesame Street. This idea that plants can talk is very pervasive in a lot of things we do. It's been questioned on shows like Mythbusters and The Simpsons. Um, and, they all want to know, can plants talk or hear? And communication amongst plants is a big, research question, and the definition of communication is actually pretty hotly debated amongst scientists. Of course, there are some that argue that true communication involves proving intent to communicate. So for humans, intent to communicate is pretty easy to prove. When I speak all of these words, I can tell you right now that I intend to speak them. But plants cannot exactly verbalize this intent, right? Whoops, what's going on? Oh no. All right. So today, what I'm going to do is show you evidence that plants make signals slash cues. They can perceive things, and then I'll provide you with some evolutionary evidence for plant quote unquote intent to communicate. And then you can decide for yourself whether or not this falls under the true Wikipedia definition of communication. So going back here, we're at plant signaling and cues right now. Now, remember when I said, there's all these types of signals that people use, and which of these can plants use? Plants don't have eyeballs. They don't move really around a bunch. They don't run away. They do exhibit phototaxis, which is moving with the sun, but yeah, they're not running away. They're not walking away. They're not raising their hand, things like that. Um, they're not doing any of those things. But what they are doing, and the one that I did leave out, was chemical, which is being perceived by smell or taste. And chemical signals are what plants rely on. So, oops, sorry. So, if we're talking about these chemicals that plants are using to communicate. We're talking about plant volatiles, or they're also called volatile organic compounds, VOCs. Um, so this picture is an example of all of the different plant compounds that are odors. And some fast facts about these guys are that all plant tissues produce and emit VOCs. So that includes roots, flowers, leaves, stems, all parts of the plant makes odors, believe it or not. These compounds are typically made of carbon, and they have a high vapor pressure at room temperature, meaning they have a tendency to evaporate or be in a gaseous state. And there's over 1,700 types of volatiles produced by plants. I believe that this is a severe underestimation of what we actually know, but to give you an idea, plants make all kinds of odors. So different kinds here, we've got green leaf volatiles. So these are 6 carbon compounds that are aldehydes, alcohols, and esters. And if you're not a chemistry person, the best way I can describe this is if you've ever mown your lawn or smelled a freshly mowed lawn, those are GLVs, green leaf volatiles. It is an immediate, within seconds, being produced by the plant to say, ouch, I'm being hurt. We've got terpenoids. So these are compounds that are derived from another compound called isoprene. So examples would be things like limonene. So that is citrus. Someone said they like the smell of pine needles. That's pinene. Other things like linalool, which would be lavender. Then we have aromatics, or compounds with the carbon ring. A good example is methyl salicylate. So this is wintergreen. So if you've ever had these lifesavers, that's what it smells like. We have sulfur-containing compounds. So you can think of things like garlic or onions. That very pungent odor are sulfur-containing volatiles. Then we've got nitrogen-containing compounds. The best way I could describe these guys are they smell really bad, like death. So an example would be indole. So when something is decomposing and rotting on the side of the road, that is indole, one of the compounds being produced. It smells very terrible. But fun fact, plants also produce indole, but it's in very low doses, so it doesn't smell like death. So that's the best way I could describe nitrogen-containing compounds at high concentrations. So you now might be asking yourself, as a scientist, how do you capture these odors off of these plants? How do you collect them? And they're in a gas, they're not super tangible to our hands. So we use what we call dynamic headspace sampling, which sounds more complicated than it actually is. So we take a plant of interest and we put it in either a jar or a bag. So I would always take, I don't know if you guys have ever used these bags to kind of stew meats in. Those work perfectly. And what you do is you use these filters that are filled with something called haze sep. It's a porous polymer that actually holds on to these odors. So you put that filter in and you push air through that container, which is called the headspace. And then you have a vacuum on the other side where you see flow out, and another filter that pulls all of those odors and air into that little white part on the filter. And that is how we get them stuck. And so we'll run this collection of air for about 8 hours. Some people do it for 24 and just switch out smells because smells differ between day and night. And then we basically take a solvent, so something like dichloromethane, and we run it through the filter, and we now have a little tube of liquid that is supposed to have these compounds in it. Um, so that's kind of how we capture these smells. And now you're saying, okay, now you have them, what do you do with them? How do you know what odors are in the vial or how much there are? And for that, we use what's called a GCMS, or a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. Um, so how the GC works, you could imagine it's a pretty decent sized machine. They are very, very expensive. I'm always nervous when I use it. Um, but the first part of the machine is called the GC. And so what happens is a little needle comes down and punctures my vial, and it takes out a little bit of that liquid sample and it injects it into the machine. And then the sample is vaporized, it's turned into a gas, and it goes down this thing called a column, which you can imagine is basically an empty tube. The tube has generally a inert gas in it, like helium, and then the compounds kind of separate out. So usually bigger things, or depending on their chemical properties, will begin to separate. So at the end of that column is a detector. So the first thing that hits is the lightest thing, or has specific bonds in it. And the detector inside the machine basically records how long it took that compound to get through the column. And it calculates the abundance of the compound, more or less. Um, and then it goes into the other part of the machine called the MS. So the MS is a lot more complicated in my opinion, but what it's doing is that it's shooting ions and breaking apart these chemical compounds into unique fragments. This also hits a detector, and then it tells us, here's the characteristic fragmentation pattern, and here's how you know it's this specific chemical. So that's how it works, more or less. I am not a organic chemist nor an analytical chemist. I just use these things to help me do what I need to do. So I think a real chemist would probably have had a heart attack at my explanation of this, but I'm an ecologist, so this works for me. Um, so now we have the chemicals. How do you know what they mean? Um, you know, I keep saying this is kind of the language. These chemicals are the language of the plants. How do I know what they're saying with these chemicals? A signal is supposed to encode information. When we talk, it's easy to know what information is being conveyed. You know, all of these different languages, it's pretty simple. But when a plant talks, figuring out what it's trying to convey can be kind of difficult. Um, there's Stinky the stinkweed. I don't know why I threw him in again, but there he is. I guess because he talks. So he's easy to understand, but all these other plants are not. So discovering the meaning behind these chemicals, we kind of have to ask, what plant part did the plant volatiles come from? What types of volatiles were made? Who might the plant be talking to? Why might the plant want to talk to them? So these are all questions that we kind of want to answer. And I'm an entomologist, so I care about how, when, or why plants, quote unquote, talk to insects. Um, and so generally, what we're doing is studying behavior in very simple laboratory settings like these. So the picture on the left is called an olfactometer. This is a very rudimentary, I wouldn't even call it a machine. More or less, what it's doing is pushing air through these big jars. So you'll see one jar has a bunch of plants, and then another jar has a bunch more plants, and then there is a Y-shaped tube that connects them. Generally, what you do is put an insect at the base of this tube, and it has two odor sources coming at it. So it can say, which do I prefer more? And it will, quote unquote, make a choice. It'll walk towards it, or it'll walk towards neither. That's also indicative to us of what's going on. So these are very simplified environments to try and figure out, what's going on here. So if we're talking about examples that are very, very well known and pretty well understood, we know that plants use these volatiles to attract pollinators, right? You've all smelled a flower. It smells very nice. So if we're answering these questions that I mentioned before, trying to parse out what the plant is saying, so we say, well, what plant part did the volatiles come from? Flowers, okay? The flower is making that smell. What type of volatiles were made? Things like terpenoids, aromatics, etc. And who might the plant be talking to? All of our pollinators. So butterflies, bees, flies, wasps, beetles, all of these are pollinators, believe it or not. I know a lot of people love the very charismatic butterflies, but all of these other guys are also pollinators. And then why might the plant talk to them? I think a lot of folks know this. So insects can facilitate plant reproduction. So that's pretty easy. So now we know, okay, this is who the plant is talking to, and here's kind of what they're asking for. They're saying, hey, come over here. I'll give you a reward of nectar or pollen, and you do my dirty business for me, right? So um, a quick primer on whether or not insects have noses. I get this question sometimes about, wait, insects can also smell? How does that work? So insects don't really have noses like we do. Instead, they smell with a bunch of different parts of their body. So antennae are a great example, but also their mouth parts have the ability to smell, and also what they use to lay eggs, called an ovipositor. So that is generally, if you think about the stinger of an insect, that's an ovipositor. And the surface of these structures are covered in these tiny hairs called cincilla. And if we really zoom in on these insect hairs, you'll see that there's tiny pores all over them. And what's happening is that this odor actually diffuses through that pore into their body, and it binds to a specific protein. Don't ask me what protein, because we're still trying to figure that out. And then it's transported to the insect's neural network, and the brain initiates a response, whether that's repellence, it's going towards something, or going away from something, it's attracted, it's going towards something, what have you. So this is a picture here of an ovipositor. So this is a fig wasp. She uses that very long appendage on her back end to lay eggs, but on that ovipositor, she can actually smell. So she can say, I want to lay my babies in this fig because it smells really good. It's a very healthy plant, what have you. So insects are a little bit more complicated than I think we humans like to uh, say, but the same thing goes here for herbivores, right? thinking of your caterpillars, your weevils, your plant bugs, your grasshoppers. What plant part are these volatiles coming from? We're talking about leaves, stems, roots, all of these plant parts that insects really want to eat. What type of volatiles were made? A bunch of different kinds. This does not even cover it, but those green leaf volatiles, so the freshly mowed lawn, terpenoids, aromatics, who might the plant be talking to? The bad guys, quote unquote, that are eating them. And why might the plant want to talk to them? So the plant doesn't get eaten or die. So what the plant is doing is they're trying to say, I am not edible. Get away from me. Go somewhere else. And the insect will smell them and say, yuck, that doesn't smell good. I'm going over here to eat this other plant. So that's pretty much how that works. So um, a really interesting one is this whole thing about plants communicating to each other. So not only do plants communicate to insects, but they communicate to other plants. So what plant part did these volatiles come from? The whole plant, leaves, stems, etc. Um, they're making sulfur and nitrogen containing compounds, a couple different ones. Um, who might the plant be talking to? So this is debated. This is a hot topic. So, don't come for me with this, but this is what the experts are saying these days. I'm not a plant person. But they're saying that the plant is probably talking to its relatives, its kin. And you're probably wondering why they might do that. And the answer is that their neighboring plants can uh, actually make these defensive compounds ahead of time. So, say if this plant in the middle is being eaten by a grasshopper, it'll send out these volatiles to its neighbors that are genetically related to it to say, hey, you need to up your defenses so that you can protect yourself from this oncoming grasshopper because he's going to hop over to you in a minute. And this ensures genetically related individuals survive. So if anyone's ever heard of the term kin selection, that's kind of what we're talking about here. So there's a couple other reasons why we think plants might want to talk to each other, but I won't go into those today. But this is something that was discovered in the 1980s. This guy had discovered that trees were talking to each other, sending volatiles back and forth, emitting this information. And he basically got shunned out of the scientific community. Nobody believed him. They said it was wonky science. And now here we are a couple decades later, and he was very right. Um, so another crazy experiment that we've done is, oh wait, hold on, let me get my notes. Do, do, do. Okay, so another fun reason that plants are using these volatiles is to ask insect predators for help. So this is what my PhD research focused on. So to kind of explain how this works, I'll show you an experiment from this guy named Ted Turlings, in 1990. And he's a Dutch scientist. He is very famous for this work in discovering the function of these plant odors. And what he did was we call them corn people. There's a lot of people who work in corn. He's a corn guy. So he took corn plants, he grew them, and they were, regular corn plants. They weren't damaged, and he collected these odors, these volatiles off of them. So he said, okay, well, they make a few smells. If you've ever, gotten really up close to a grass, you've smelled it. It has a little bit of an odor. It's nothing super strong. Said, okay. Then he took some scissors, he cut the corn plant, and he was like, all right, now what does it smell like? It made some more volatiles. The smell wasn't really that different, but it was stronger. Makes sense. Then he said, all right, what happens if I put caterpillars on this corn plant? And surprise, surprise, as we know, the plant produced a crazy amount of different volatiles. Um, and so, it produced these high amounts of VOCs. And these VOCs weren't found in the other groups. They were unique to this plant that was attacked with caterpillars. And so what he then did was he said, I wonder if this helps predators find their prey. And sure enough, parasites and predators were highly attracted to these odors from attacked corn plants. And this makes sense, right? If the corn plant is being attacked, it wants to get rid of those caterpillars on it because it can't do it itself. It can't pick them off, right? So this is something that we call a call for help. And these parasites will come in, they'll kill those caterpillars, thankfully. And the corn plant benefits because it gets rid of those pesky herbivores. And that parasite benefits because, well, it just got free dinner, right? So if we answer those questions that I had mentioned before, what plant part are the volatiles coming from? Leaves, stems, whatever that caterpillar is eating. And we now know that they can also come from the roots and help natural or predators below the ground find their prey, but that's a whole other topic. So it works above and below ground. What type of volatiles were made? A whole crap ton. Terpenoids, aromatics, all of that good stuff. Who might the plant be talking to? So I said the word parasitoids. So for those of you who are maybe not so familiar, these are wasps that lay their eggs either inside of or on top of different insects. And it's, if you've ever seen the movie Alien with Sigourney Weaver, where the aliens implant their yucky eggs into the humans and then they burst out the chest bursters. This is the same thing. I believe that these were actually the inspiration for the movie Alien. Um, so there you go. We have, I think this is the actual wasp, Cotesia marginiventris down here that he studied in this study. And you can see her ovipositor. Remember, we talked about that. That thing can actually smell. Inserting her eggs. And if you're wondering, does the caterpillar live after inserting eggs? Sometimes yes. It depends on the species of parasitoid. Other times, no, kills them immediately because she will also, it's a female wasp that will feed on the insect as well. So it depends on her and what she's into, I guess. But we also have other things like predators. So lady beetles, mantids, even birds can detect these volatiles that the plants are producing and use it as kind of like a honing signal to say, aha, that's where my prey is. Because if you imagine yourself as a bird and there's 100 trees, how do you know where to start to look for food? Right? This is pretty beneficial for them. Why might the plant talk to them? Again, so they get rid of that herbivore and the plant doesn't get eaten. Um, but if we're going back and we're thinking for a second, remember I said that the plant responded differently to the caterpillar and they made a whole bunch of VOCs or volatiles or odors. Why is the plant's response to the scissor damage and insect damage different? Shouldn't damage just be damage to the plant? And that leads us right into plant perception. So plants perceiving what's going on around them. So as it turns out, the plant can tell the difference between scissors and the insect because it is able to taste. So this is um, a caterpillar's spit, or this is really regurgitant. So as scientists, a common thing that we do is we make caterpillars throw up. You can do it yourself. You pick them up and you give them a tiny squeeze, they barf. You take a capillary tube and you collect it. And what happens is that the spit contains all these proteins and enzymes. And the plant says, oh my gosh, it's that herbivore. And the plant's response to herbivore spit is actually so specific that they know what species the herbivore is, they know the sex, they know the age, they know a ton of different information just from the insect's spit. So plants are actually pretty smart, as it turns out. And they can detect things like pheromones. So insects use, when I say pheromone, pheromones are odors that are used to communicate between two individuals of the same species. So sex pheromones to attract a mate, aggregation pheromones, ants use those to say, hey, come over here, there's food. There's trail pheromones, ants use those too. Ants are just a good example of pheromones where they'll kind of leave a trail so everyone knows where the food is. So plants can even pick up on those odors. So they are actually highly perceptive of and being able to taste and smell more or less. Um, and now you're probably wondering, all right, well, where is the plant's nose if it's able to detect all of these odors and tastes and things like that? Um, and the answer is that it's likely on the plant's surface. So these little pores, those dark green pores on the surface of the leaf, are called stomata. And these are used for gas exchange, so taking in CO2, releasing oxygen. And these insect-derived odors and things like that can actually enter through those pores. um, we still are trying to understand the molecular mechanism behind how this works. You know, what odorant binding proteins are there in the plant? How does the plant respond? What is really happening there? Some of the odors, in fact, can just diffuse through that leaf, but we don't really have the best grasp yet on how the plant nose works. Um, and another interesting thing that plants can do is that they can detect caterpillar footsteps or touch. So this paper by Hall et al. In 2004, um, so you're seeing that they put caterpillars on soybean and tobacco plants, and what they found was that the caterpillar's feet, which are A and C of this diagram here, caused micro abrasions on the plant leaf surface, which they used electron microscopy to see. So these little holes in the plant's surface, and it caused the plant to synthesize defensive chemical compounds because it could feel the insect damaging it even so slightly. Walking on it, it could feel it. So this is pretty crazy. And plants can also hear. So this one also is a little bit, I wouldn't say debated, but I think people are still kind of skeptical on this one. So Apple and Cocroft in 2014 recorded sounds. So they recorded caterpillars chewing, and they recorded the wind, and they recorded all this different stuff. And they did not necessarily put headphones on the plant, but they kind of surrounded it with speakers. And they had plants that were listening to caterpillar chewing sounds. They had plants that were listening to the wind as their control. And what they found again, and you'll see this with this graph, is that plants produce more defensive compounds, which we call one type is called glucosinolates, when insect chewing was played versus the wind. So you're seeing here on this x-axis chewing vibration amplitude. So that's how loud they were playing it. So the louder they played it, the more defensive compounds these plants were making. So the plant was perceiving a higher chance of threat. They were getting ready to defend themselves. So one of my advisors for my PhD was actually trying to also record these insect chewing sounds. They're very soft. I don't have good hearing, but I don't think most people can hear them naturally. So we're attaching these little microphones to the plants, and you'd see someone in the corner with headphones on trying to very carefully listen to what was going on. So pretty cool stuff that plants can hear and touch and taste. Plants can perceive. So, all right. Now, remember when I said that if it's true communication, we kind of have to prove that the plant wants to communicate. They evolved this trait for the sake of communication. So these guys, Lin et al., who I think was a postdoc actually with that guy before, Ted Turlings. He has a huge lab. I think he's in Switzerland. So this was a paper that they had most recently. And they were studying this plant called ragwort. So if you're familiar with, say, like St. John's wort, it's not related. They look similar, but this is just the plant down here. Um, and it's native to Europe and parts of Asia. It has a bunch of herbivore pests. You see these very cool colored caterpillars here. And in the United States, it's invasive. This plant is invasive. So it's actually evolved for many years independently of herbivore pests. So this is a common topic that we entomologists talk about. When you take something from its uh, normal place and you move it somewhere else where it's never been before, it escapes all of its enemies in the world. So you think about the spotted lanternfly right now, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's from, I believe, to certain parts of China. It was in Korea. It came over here. So any predators that eats it are gone. They're not here. They're not in the United States. So now its populations are booming because nothing's there to control it, right? So there's this idea that when you take something, you move it somewhere else, it's going to change and evolve independently of its enemies, herbivores, whatever you want to say. And what they did was they collected the volatiles and they found that the native ragwort plants and the invasive ragwort plants produce totally different volatiles, totally different odors. You would think that they would produce the same kind because they're the same plant, right? But that wasn't the case. And what they also found that native ragwort was more attractive to our parasitoids, those big wasps. Well, they're not big. They were big in the picture. Those parasitoids that are laying eggs inside of insects. Those parasitoids prefer the native ragwort. So to kind of break that down for you, what that means is that the parasitoids in their natural habitat with the natural ragwort were like, okay, this is the signal. I know it. Now, when the plant was removed from its natural environment, its volatiles changed. It didn't have any herbivores eating it. So why did it need to send out volatiles to predators? It didn't. So basically, what we found was that plants are keeping this trait, this multifaceted trait of volatiles in that natural habitat because it had those herbivores there eating them. In the United States, they did not. So this was one of the biggest papers to come out recently to say plants keep these traits to communicate with parasitoids, to communicate with herbivores. And then when they don't have any herbivores or natural enemies or predators to communicate with, they lose them. They don't need them. So this was kind of our one of the biggest proofs of intent to communicate. There are a lot of folks trying to work on this. Evolution studies kind of take a lot of tinkering. So I'm not sure when the next proof will come, but this is about as good as we have right now. Now, all right, we've talked about communication. I've shown you that plants definitely make signals. They're producing stuff. They're definitely perceiving stuff. There's some evidence that these traits are conserved for the purpose of communication. Now, what do we do with this information? So scientists, their job is to take what we learn and apply them to real world problems so that we can, produce something of substance. So how can we use volatiles to improve agriculture? And this is what I'm really interested in and what a lot of my work revolves around. And so what I've got here, we're going to take a step back and say, why do we care about improving agriculture? So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is called the Integrated Pest Management Pyramid or the IPM pyramid. At the bottom, we have what we call preventative strategies for getting rid of pests in agriculture. Whether or not you know it, we lose billions of dollars to pests eating our crops. It's very bad. We got to do something. So we have preventative practices at the bottom. So things like crop rotation, intercropping, things like that. The next step up is detection. So actually looking to see if there are any insects. And then the next steps are control methods. So are we going to go out and remove those infested plants? Are we going to set out a bunch of predators to go kill those pests? Are we going to spray insecticides, which is at the very top of the pyramid? So you'll notice that as you go up the pyramid, it also increases in toxicity. So obviously insecticides they're toxins to kill insects. They also are very expensive to apply, unfortunately. So ideally, you kind of want to hang out at the bottom of the pyramid. These are the most sustainable, they cost the least amount, they're the least toxic or damaging to the environment. And you'll see there this term called resistant varieties under that bubble. So basically, if we can make plants that are able to defend themselves, so remember, we want to repel them, those pesky herbivores. We want to call in our buddies, these predators to get rid of them. So this is what we call a resistant variety, or a type of crop that is able to protect itself without any human intervention. And you might be saying, well, why would we want to stick to the bottom of the pyramid other than, cost and toxicity if that wasn't convincing enough for you? I'll show you this. So this is called the pesticide treadmill. I know it's a blurry photo. I'm sorry. I'll work on making a new one. But what you'll see here, if you start at the top, it says apply a new product. So you walk into your cornfield, say you're Farmer Joe, you go out there, you see a new pest, and you say, okay, I got to take care of this. You spray insecticides. It kills all of the caterpillars. Whoop-de-doo. There are more caterpillars a month later, so you continue to spray the same product. What happens over time is that the insects very quickly evolve different traits to become immune to these insecticides. They literally will not die no matter how much toxin you spray on them. So, okay, well, you apply more. The pests become more resistant. So fewer are dying. You apply more at a greater frequency, and then it's just out of control. Nobody is dying. You have so many pests everywhere. And then what ends up happening is you find a new insecticide, a new product, and then it begins over again. So this is the treadmill, the dreaded treadmill that we try so desperately to avoid. Because insecticides, I say they're an important tool for farmers. Do not get me crossed about that. But scientists are really trying to find ways to reduce our pesticide use so that we can use one insecticide for a longer period of time. We don't want to keep making toxins and putting them out into the world. We just kind of want to use one and get to know it a little bit better. So if we're taking our information about plant volatiles or plant odors and putting them to use, we can do things like make lures for pests. So I know this is a very bizarre picture on the left, but what that is a disc full of methyl salicylate, or that wintergreen smell. So for some pests, they really actually love that odor. And you put it out on a stake like this, and the very simplest form to kill a pest, once you've attracted it, is a sticky card. So you see they all get stuck here. We prefer not to use those because you get a lot of what's called bycatch, or other undesirable insects or mammals or birds, unfortunately, that get stuck on there, and you don't want that. But there are specialized traps. I'm sure some of you have seen them, where the insect flies in and gets stuck and can't get back out. So we can take and figure out, okay, these are plant odors that are really attractive. Let's amp it up to 100 and make it this hot spot that's really attractive. The pests come, we trap them, and hopefully get rid of a good chunk of them, especially if they're mating females. This is a very cool technology, we'll call it, called the push-pull system. And this is widely used across Africa, and it's used for corn, or maize, if whatever you want to call it. So what they figured out is that this plant called Napier grass, it produces these volatile chemicals that are actually really attractive to moths. The moths want to lay their eggs on maize, but man, that Napier grass smells really good. So they move away from the maize and they go out there. And in between the maize rows are these plants called Desmodium. And what they found was that these plants produce really repellent volatiles. So that's what's called our push. So you say you're a moth, you're looking at these corn plants, you're saying, oh wow, but this just smells terrible. So you move out of the way. Something else on the edge of the plot smells really good, Napier grass. So this is the push and the pull them in so that they're laying eggs on the Napier grass and not the maize, which is definitely the ideal situation. And if you're wondering, yes, this is used in Africa. No, we do not use it here. Our agriculture here is so highly industrialized, commercialized, whatever you want to say, that we have acres and acres and acres of corn. We very rarely have these intercropping moments where there's a bunch of different plants and genetic diversity in a plot. This is just not what we do. But this works well for smaller areas, and farms in Africa right now. So this is another application of figuring out, all right, what are these volatiles doing, and which volatiles are these, and what plants are making them, and how do we use that to get rid of pests? And then this one is my favorite, and kind of what my dissertation was really interested in is, can we breed plants to be really attractive to pollinators? Can we breed them to be really attractive to our predators and our parasitoids? It's almost like a natural control mechanism. Can we, rather than spraying insecticides, attract these predators so that they can just pick off all of those herbivores? And this is, believe it or not, I'm sure you're like, duh, this is really complicated to do. There are many genes that control the quote unquote odor blend because it is never just one odor being produced by a plant, there's a whole bunch of them. And we have not quite figured out how to do that yet. What we have been able to do is create genetically modified plants that always produce one specific odor and a lot of it. And so we have genetically modified, I think it was wheat or barley, one of the two, to produce this one terpenoid compound at way higher amounts. And it did attract more of these parasitoids and predators, and it did decrease the number of herbivores or pests on the plant. So it worked. The problem is that once you start messing with the plant's genetic machinery, other things begin to not work so well. So those plants actually had lower yield. And if you've ever talked to a farmer, the thing that they care about is yield. So we're still working on this and trying to figure out how we can really make it the best of both worlds. But this is not something that I would say you're going to see in the next 5 or 10 years. It's probably going to be like 20. But this is something that I think could be a really sustainable and cool option for us. And so if we're talking about a summary here, plants are very diverse in the chemical odors they produce. The odors help plants interact with a bunch of different kind of organisms, other plants, other insects, things, microbes. I didn't talk about microbes, but they also use that to interact with them. Um, Plants can also perceive what's going on around them. They can hear, they can taste, they can touch. And plant odors are really useful for helping us to get rid of a bunch of different agricultural pests right now. Um, and so I'd like to thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'll take them. So thank you.
Woo! Thank you, Emily. You can unshare, come back. I'll put a spotlight on you and spotlight, and we can open it up for questions. There are some in the chat box that we can go through, and if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and you can unmute. So Richard early on just talks about the fungi, the mycorrhizae kind of root tree plant communication system, and how that might be related to what you are studying.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Suzanne Simard. If someone could tell me a little bit about what she was studying, that would be cool. Because I'm not super familiar. Maybe she's a more plant person than an insect person. We don't really cross paths all the time.
Richard, did you want to say anything about that? Maybe not.
That's okay. But what I
Okay.
can say based on that,
Oh, he's got a
you
no mic, but
know,
he left you. He's got no mic tonight, so he left a
okay.
link in there for you to click on in the chat.
Okay. It's loading, but I'll go back to that one. The book Light Eaters is a very good read. Someone else recommended that to me. I have not read it, but I definitely got to check it out because now this is the second person who's told me about it. So, got to look into that. Where do GMOs fall on the IPN pyramid? So they actually fall on the bottom of the pyramid because they're considered resistant. Um, when you're talking about GMOs in terms of killing insects, we're talking about BT or Bacillus thuringiensis. So these are plants that have a bacterial gene in them to kill insects. I think it's 97% of corn and cotton today is BT corn and cotton. So we don't really make non-GMO corn and cotton anymore. Um, I know some people have a negative connotation of it, but I think it really helps out our farmers. So um, I definitely encourage people to read about BT. It's really neat. Um, any recommendations for push-pull vegetable gardening? What are some good sacrificial plants for veggies? So, it would be really hard to figure out what a good push-pull system is for vegetable gardening, but what I can recommend is planting a bunch of flowers, like a flower patch around your garden, um, because this will, rather than, repel herbivores, you're going to be attracting your natural enemies. So those are your predators, your parasitoids, because they don't just eat, the insects, they are also interested in things like pollen and nectar, believe it or not, because most things are actually an omnivore. They're interested in more than just one thing. So if you can increase the number of spiders, parasitoid wasps, ladybugs in your garden, that's definitely the way to go. I wish we knew more about push-pull systems in smaller um, or other crops even, because really it's mostly used for corn right now. I don't know if they figured out different push pulls for things like cotton and stuff like that. Um, Interested to know what got you interested in entomology. I was interested in entomology because I learned actually about BT during my bachelor's, and I thought that was the coolest thing in the world because what the plant is able to do is produce these, they're called BT toxins or BT crystals. And when the insect ingests these BT crystals, they actually interact with their gut and are activated by their gut pH and different proteases and cause holes to form in their gut. And then ultimately they die of sepsis and they are a pile of mush, which is pretty morbid and terrible, but very cool and was very cool to me. So that's what got me excited about it. Um, is the cut grass smell synthesized at the time the grass is cut, or is it already in the plant and released through the cut? That's a good question. So the answer is both. So the plant has some of these compounds at the ready to just break open and go for it. And then this is like within seconds and minutes of the plant being cut, it will produce more of that odor. So the answer is kind of both. Um, yep. Now I'm reading about Suzanne Simard, best known. Do, do, do. Just defense signals below ground. Where is she? Oregon State. I don't know her. She used rare carbon isotopes as tracers to measure the flow and sharing of carbon between individual trees. Hmm. Interspecies cooperation. Yeah, I'm not familiar with this work, but that's very cool. Um, so yeah, trees do communicate not only above ground but below ground. Um, And yeah, so things like microbes can actually kind of play a role in what plant smells are the plant is producing. So a good example is, I don't know if you guys know this, but plant diseases, especially in agriculture, are generally vectored by insects. So how mosquitoes vector things like dengue and Zika and all this terrible stuff to us, things like aphids and whiteflies and stuff like that vector plant diseases to plants. And the viruses in plants actually hijack their genetic machinery and cause them to produce really extra attractive volatiles. And so the insect will actually prefer to go to the diseased plant. So then the disease gets to hitch a ride and then spread it to other plants, um, which is pretty wacky. They talk about carbon tracer experiment in I'll have to check that out. The entangled life. Any other questions?
Yeah, are there any other questions? And feel free if you want to raise your hand, we can call on you if you want to do a direct question um, as well. Is there any, you mentioned that the VOCs that are produced are different during the day than the night. Are there any reasons why that was?
Yeah, so, well, if you think about a plant, the plant loves the light. That's when it's producing all of its sugars and it's really happy. And during the day, the stomata generally, well, I guess it depends on the plant. Um, the VOCs are escaping through those stomata. And then at night they close their stomata so that they conserve water generally, and there's just fewer volatiles coming out of the plants, and that's why it's different in quantity at night. The types can be different, but it's not, it depends, basically. Um, we're not exactly sure why nighttime volatiles would be it would be beneficial to produce nighttime volatiles differently than daytime.
Would it be it's just different, a different suite of insects that are the nocturnal insects that are coming out, or maybe?
Yeah, so that's possible. One of the things that usually bothers me about us entomologists is that we don't like to work at night. We do not work the third shift. So there are so many unanswered questions about what's going on when the lights are off. And I tried during my PhD to convince my students to put on headlamps and go out and see what volatiles the plants were making. Do the predators that come to those plants change? But no one would go for it. So this is an unanswered question that I definitely wanted the answer to, and no one would go for it. So
We need to find some night owl entomologists there.
I know everybody goes to bed by 8 p.m.
Alan, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, Emily, and thanks. Great, very interesting in so many ways. You talked about that invasive plant, and and I know there's also the invasive fly and stuff. Are there ever adaptations or something happens where then the invasive plant does get attacked, or at some point something does come in, and how do you know how that kinds of things happen where they all of a sudden they find there's a predator?
Yeah, so we like to joke that eventually the predators do catch up and the plant does catch up. So with spotted lanternfly, especially, I predict, and this, I guess really don't quote me on this because I might be wrong, but I think similar to things like kudzu bug, um, the natural or the predators and the parasitoids are eventually going to say, this doesn't taste so bad, and there's a lot of it, and picking up on the insect smells and the plant smells, because remember, this is a two-way street. So the plant will respond when it's being eaten. The natural enemies or the predators don't really know what that odor means yet. So they do learn and they do have the capacity to learn. And so as time goes on, they're able to associate that smell that the plant is making with that insect if it's invasive. But yeah, insect learning is pretty cool. Um, Again, we know a little bit about it. The parasitoid wasps especially are able to retain a decent amount of information, and that information can technically be passed to its progeny too. So that's pretty cool. Um,
And
I think you said you.
forget about quoting you. Just there's already odds that are up in Vegas for what you just said. No.
Oh, right, yeah. Don't bet the house on it, Alan. Um, I think you said you studied ticks. If yes, what did you study? Do you know of plants that deter ticks? Oh boy. So plants that deter ticks. I don't know of a plant that deters ticks. What I can say is that if you are in an area where there are a bunch of ticks or Lyme disease is very likely, um, I treated my clothes. There are a bunch of products out there that work very well. Um, yeah, because ticks don't eat plants, so I don't know if they would particularly care. There are people who light things like citronella candles, and they say that they're very repellent to the yucky bugs. And sometimes these things work, sometimes they don't. Um, but yeah, I don't know that much about tick odor perception, um, or if they would care about plant odors in particular, because we have done studies where things like mosquitoes, We produce VOCs too. So what they did was they put the bag around someone's hand and collected the odors. And certain types of people actually just smell better to mosquitoes. So they're probably picking up on us odors and not plant odors, unfortunately.
Question about the language here. If with the treadmill thing, the
Mhm.
evolution of the insects to resist insecticides, are is the suite of chemicals always changing within plants and or the insects themselves, so that if the insect is, um, can the plant change its what it's saying to the plant, to or to the insect or to the other things, to confuse it, or do they are those chemical signals, do they change over time?
Yeah, so I think what you are describing, when we're talking about the pesticide treadmill, that's a little different than what you're describing, which is the evolutionary arms race. And so the answer is that yes, probably. I do not know of anyone who has studied a group of plants over time for long enough to detect these changes. But based on, the principles of evolution and things like that, I would expect they are constantly trying to one up each other. Maybe trying to make more attractants for these parasitoids, but we do not know that. So remember, I didn't say this outright. Volatiles were discovered, like plant volatiles that are caused by insect feeding, were discovered in 1990, technically 1988, but whatever. So, other things in science have been around for quite some time, and then this stuff is still actually pretty new in the world of science. So, I I would think that that's possible.
So we're on the frontier, guys. We're on the frontier of science here. It's just fascinating. It's great. Are there any experiments that we could do at our in our home to see, to test these things out?
Let's see. That's a good question. I think it would certainly be interesting. So, if you've got a spotted lanternfly problem in your yard, I know a lot of people have trees that get attacked by them. There are commercial lures that are being sold right now, and I'm personally very curious if they differ in attraction. Usually, when companies make these things, they kind of present only the best data and not the truthful stuff. Um, so that would be interesting. Um, I think something that would also be cool is say you plant things like cucumbers or watermelons in your garden. There's a bunch of different varieties or cultivars of these things. You should test different ones. Different cultivars in a species, it is a single species, but there are different varieties. They actually also differ in their volatiles. So you can test the waters and see if one is more attractive than the other to herbivores. See if you can manage pests on your own. OYO.
Go ahead, Alan. You got your hand up.
Yeah, last one that I can think of. I mean, we generally think of like herbs and spices as having like stronger kind of scent qualities, and I'm wondering if you've done any work or anything, information about those and what makes them attractive to us, maybe, or just, is there anything in terms of like, the quote volume of the scent that impacts anything?
Yeah, so something to keep in mind is that if we're talking about a corn plant, um, that produces literal nanograms of scent. Our noses can't really pick it up. The bugs can, ours can't. And then when we're talking about things that smell really good, like rosemary, remember we've bred these things to have these properties, to taste really good, to smell really good. So there is some slight human touch in there to really amp up these odors because we like them. We select the plants that are preferable to us. And so yeah, we just haven't really picked out corn for its odor, but we have for rosemary and mint and things like that. So, hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, they do produce it's thousands and thousands more nanograms, which still does not sound like a lot, but it is a lot of odor compared to something like a corn plant, which we call a quiet plant.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I think it was underneath part of what I was asking, but also just in terms of like what you talked about here with just other purposes of communication. Is the
Mm,
only purpose in those, is it really because we've bred them and that really is not, the insects, the flies, they're not really, it's not a big deal to them?
yeah, so here's the thing about those specific plants. Some people say that they have insecticidal properties, some of those compounds that smell really good, um, that are in really high concentrations in the plant. Sometimes they're not so insecticidal, and this is currently a problem that I deal with, where it's like we want to make corn plants that smell really good for these predators, but as we have domesticated them, things have kind of gone wacky and changed. So the plant's original, I guess, intent for these smells or these compounds changes as we change the plant, um, which is tough. So now we're trying to go back to these wild ancestor plants and breed them with our current cultivars to bring back some of these preferred insecticidal traits, natural insecticidal traits. So we we've changed a lot of what the plant is doing and why it's doing it, which um, is both for the better and for the worse.
Great, thanks so much.
Hmm.
And I guess I have to thank my parents for how good I smell too.
Okay, there you go.
All right. Any more questions for tonight on plant smells or anything? Great. Well, thank you, Emily, so much for taking time out of your schedule, sharing this wonderful research, this information with us. It was fascinating. I have a lot to kind of digest now and a new way to look at plants, which is wonderful. And everyone, thank you for joining us. I hope that you're able to stay well, stay warm, and stay curious. And we'll see you soon at another program online or at the museum. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.